From the Radio Cafe and Quivira Coalition, you're listening to Down to Earth, the Planet to Plate podcast. I'm your host, Mary Charlotte Domandi. On today's program, we're going to be talking about women in farming and ranching. That's right after this quick announcement. Registration is open for the Regenerate Conference. Regenerate will take place November 6th through 8th in Denver, Colorado. This year's conference, Innovating for a Resilient Future, will explore data, technology, information collection, and sharing ways of learning and knowing, and the myriad approaches to fulfilling our ecological roles. Join in this exploration of innovation with leading thinkers and doers. You can find out more at regenerateconference.com. And now to our program. I'd like to welcome Jules Salinas. She's Executive Director of Women, Food, and Agriculture Network, WFAN.org. She's also a beekeeper, and she will be speaking at the Regenerate Conference this November in Denver. Welcome to Down to Earth.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here.
So let's talk about women in agriculture. Women have always been in agriculture.
Yes.
I mean, since hunter-gatherers, we were the gatherers. At the same time, we are sometimes invisible in agriculture. What does that look like?
That's the perfect word, invisible. And that's actually how WFAN started. Back in 1995, our founding mothers, Denise O'Brien and Kathy Lawrence, attended the UN Women's Conference in Beijing. And they basically said, we're here. We've been here, always been here, but we need to be recognized and we need to be able to access land. We need to be able to grow. We need to be able to grow organically. We need to be able to be seen by the lenders because women at the time, the invisibility, would walk into a FSA office or a other organization like lending organization or even technical assistance organization. And I'd be like, where's your husband?
Yeah.
Is your brother with you? Where's your dad? And it's like, no, I'm the farmer. Sure you are, sweetie. And it's just, and it's sad. It's 2024 and that is still happening, right? We hear from our members all the time that they're just invisibilized. They're overlooked, even if they're there with their partner or their brother, for example, buying a tractor. We did some roundtables with Teresa Ledger Fernandez, who's our one of our representatives here in New Mexico. And she did a roundtable, and they were talking about how one of the women were looking at tractor, and she had done all the background research. She had secured the funding for it and was just like looking for specs on the tractor at the showroom. And she was there with her brother, and they just would only speak to her brother. Yeah. And she's like, here, I'm sitting right here.
Right.
So it's something that continues. The other part of that is that even in the U.S. Census, the farming census, the agricultural census, they didn't even have an opportunity for women to be represented or even have a voice in that. It was like, well, who's the primary farmer? Well, there is no primary when there's oftentimes a couple, right. But because they asked first, is there a man there? Well, then that man became like the default primary farmer, even if the woman was doing most of the farming.
I mean, and so much of the reality of farming is that one or the other of the couple has an off-farm job.
Correct.
So even if the man had the off-farm job, he was considered the farmer?
Right, absolutely.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So there was this meeting at the UN conference in Beijing, and I mean, it's great to have a conference and be heard, but then what happens with that being heard? Like, how does that translate into something positive for women farmers?
Right. So they came back from the conference, and there was a lot of interest in keeping that momentum going, still continuing to have these conversations. And it was partly because Denise, for example, would look out over her church and see all these white-haired old women that had been farmers, that have always been farmers.
Now, Denise
O'Brien, sorry, she's our founding mother. She's out in Iowa. And she said, I'm looking out and there's just the sea of women, and not just Denise, but all of the founding mothers of WFAN. And they are oftentimes widowed, and they've been never given any training or any guidance or any resources to be able to either continue the farm or to negotiate with their tenant farmers, like how to grow that is aligned with their values. And so all these women, or most of these women, not all, but most of the women had values that were aligned with justice, that had gender equity, and what was called regenerative ag back then, but organic farming and
sustainability.
they called it ecological. We still keep it in our mission statement.
Right.
Ecological farming, food and farming systems. And so they said, let's start holding learning circles. Let's have conversations, just kind of like this, right?
Yeah.
Only with a few more women, and saying like, what are your concerns? What are the things that you're experiencing? And from that, those are the sort of the seeds of WFAN. So that was 1997 when they first formed as WFAN. So 2 years after the conference. And then it took about another, till 2011 is when we finally got our 501c3.
Okay.
We were under the Tides Foundation as a fiscal sponsor, yeah. And so
Yeah.
it's interesting because now we are a fiscal sponsor for the Queer Farmers Network. So it's like continuing that, playing it forward. Sort of thing.
Right. So when you talk about these learning circles, it reminds me of the consciousness raising circles of the previous generation of women, not necessarily farmers, but like women who got together and said, can we just like talk about the reality that we're living because we're living it and we're not talking to anybody else about it?
Yeah.
What were those early circles? And I'm not necessarily that you were there, but from what you know, what were those early circles like?
It sounds exactly like what you just described. It was very intentionally a circle with no head and no, even if you brought somebody in, they had to sit in circle. It was very nonviolent communication based. And that the belief that we all have something to teach each other and that there's no head to that circle, right? There's nobody coming in and being the subject matter expert.
Right.
They're instead saying, here's my experience. I had a farmer tenant who is an 8th generation farmer and does not want to grow organically, even though I have insisted that they grow organically. How would you negotiate that? Or have you had an experience like that? And then you would say to me like, yeah, I did. And this is how I did it. This is the attorney that I spoke to. This is the contract that I wrote up. And they would share resources and they would share insight and also how to have those conversations, those tough conversations sometimes with, tenant farmers, for example.
Another thing that happens in circles like this is women sometimes or whatever the group is, whatever realize that we've internalized some of the negative stereotypes about ourselves.
Absolutely.
What does that look like?
So it's interesting you say it like that. I went to the women's conference this last year in Albuquerque for Rocky Mountain Farmers Union, or actually I think it was the whole farmers, like the National Farmers Union Women's Conference. And there were a number of women there. They would just say, I just want to be seen as a farmer. I don't want to be seen as a woman farmer. I understand that sentiment, but at the same time, that's negating all of the real challenges that are unique to gender discrimination, I think. Because they have like, well, we're all, we have a woman vice president, so of course we're all equal now, just like we had a black president, so there's no more discrimination, there's no more racism anymore, right? And that same sort of thing, I think, is how you start to see some of that internalized misogyny of like, well, little lady, you can pick up or just be a farmer if you and to also put into practice, I think often sort of the patriarchal approaches to how we see the world, how we see the land, instead of being a part of a system, seeing ourselves as above the system. And I think that that's a big distinction between how, and maybe I'm Pollyannish in this regard, but I really think that women and non-binary folks and of course some men see themselves as part of the system. Meaning,
like part of an ecosystem,
exactly.
Like we're part of nature.
Yes, like we're part of nature.
Yeah.
Rather than masters, dominion, overlords of it, as separated from it and above it somehow, right?
I mean, I think that has a lot to do also with our relationship to technology. Like this idea, and this is something that I am thinking about a lot because of thinking about regenerative agriculture and what agriculture can do to benefit the environment. There are so many people who are in the mentality that technology will save us, which seems like it's part of that dominion kind of thinking.
Yes.
As opposed to thinking like nature, and the thinking like a watershed, thinking like a mountain, like all these ideas that if we work with nature's systems and processes, we will actually succeed far better and the earth will succeed far better and we will have food.
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting. I saw right over there that you have a copy of Braiding Sweetgrass. And that was one of the first times reading that. And actually, I listened to it on audiobook as well because Robin Wall Kimmerer, she actually does the audiobook.
Yes.
And I just
She's got such a beautiful voice.
does.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't read Braiding Sweetgrass, it's a beautiful book.
It is
a profound book.
And a profound book. And one of the themes throughout that book is the idea of reciprocity. And I didn't really know how to think about reciprocity. Like, what does that look like? And reading that and hearing her speak to it, it shifted my perspective of how I approach my personal relationship to land, to my environment, to even as I'm a beekeeper, as you know, to working with my bees, that I want it to be a reciprocal relationship and not just I'm going to take all the honey and aren't you lucky that I give you a box to live in? It's like, no. This is definitely a reciprocal relationship. And I think that that's what our farmers and our ranchers really want to see. When we talk about regenerative agriculture, it's also reciprocal agriculture.
Very much so. It's interesting that you say women want to be seen as farmers, not just women farmers, because the same thing happens in the arts, like women rebelling against being seen as women writers. Mm-hmm. A woman is writing a spy novel or whatever. Like, does she have to be called a woman writer? I mean, I can see both sides of that.
Right. I can see both sides of that as well. But I think it's interesting that, you talk about women authors a lot of times, not all the time, but oftentimes women would use their initials or a gender,
Right.
sort of neutral name to not be outed as a woman writer, so that they would be taken seriously as a writer.
Right.
Right. And so I think if there wasn't that discrimination, then women wouldn't be so inclined to try to not be seen as women. When you be talking about just being a farmer, not a woman farmer, again, that I think takes away from that. Well, what does it mean to be a woman farmer? And it's not just our breasts or whatever that is, but it is also that, right? Because, when we did these focus groups with the Congresswoman and her staff, we talked about how all the farming equipment, or a lot of the farming equipment, is made from male bodies.
Right.
6'2", predominantly white male bodies that are like one's particular body type. And some of us are not that. I'm 5'1" or 5'2", depending on the day. The shoes, right? And I, used to weigh 124 pounds. And now when I do my beekeeping, we use Langstroth hives, which go vertically up, right? And this last harvest, we had one of my hives has 6 boxes deep. And so that's like basically 6 foot tall or higher from the ground. And we're trying to harvest honey. So there's 4 of us. We have a women's collective, beekeeping collective. And it took us, all 4 of us, on ladders, trying to hand down frames of honey rather than trying to take the whole box off. The build for this was designed around male bodies and a certain type. And so the Women in Agriculture bill, that is a bipartisan bill that Teresa Ledger Fernandez put forward, talks about doing research into building farm equipment and ranching equipment that is tailored to women's bodies. Like, what does that look like?
And what does that look like?
In beekeeping, for example, that might look like a horizontal hive. Rather than going up vertically, you can actually have them in a horizontal hive, and that can be a top bar hive, or it can be what they call a horizontal Langstroth hive, which is those same deeps, but instead of going up, you just add on
to the side.
To the side.
Okay.
And so that's the kind of thing. Or, tractors that you can move the seat up, and you don't have to put blocks
that hard.
Put blocks on pedals. I mean, I had an old Jeep that I literally had blocks put on the pedals so that I could drive it. And I know how to drive stick shift, but I mean, and it was probably completely illegal, but that was the only way I could drive that Jeep.
Right.
So it's the same in farm equipment, right? Like whether it's a tractor or whether it's even a hoe or a tiller, not that you should be doing tilling, but whatever that looks like what is the ergonomics of working with different body types?
Right. And as we know, we are different, and that's one of the things that makes sexism so tricky. We're not the same in the way we think. We're not the same in our body strength. We've got different strengths. And I mean, I think that the kind of equality that we need means recognizing our strengths mutually and working together and learning from each other.
Right. I agree with that 100%. The other challenge, though, going back to with the mechanization of farming, that all makes sense in terms of like, okay, we can have these tools and these mechanics that might be able to help farming, but a lot of that requires resources and financing.
Which brings us to our next topic.
Exactly.
Access to capital.
Exactly. Access to capital. And then that's the challenge, right? Because that is still really restricted. And, yes, since 1974, women have been able to have credit cards. But in terms...
Which is so recent.
Yes.
That's my lifetime.
Yeah, it's my lifetime, right? And interestingly, around that same time was when it was the go big or go home shift.
Go big or get out.
Get out. Yeah, go big or get out. Shift in farming and food systems, right? And so that go big or get out also led to greater mechanization of farming. And when you have that combined with lack of capital and lack of access to land, you saw the collapse of the small farmer, and particularly the small woman farmer or the family farmer.
So what are the kinds of things that WFAN is doing to really address some of these problems?
So there's a few things. On the programmatic level, we have two main programs that work with women and non-binary farmers, and that is our Women Caring for the Land programming. And that is sort of the original programming where we still hold learning circles. We still have conversations with women landowners and talk about how they can put ecological practices on their land, even if they're not the ones doing the primary farming. How do you talk to your tenants? How do you get them to sign off on and agree to doing things such as cover cropping and no-till and looking at water systems and addressing this horrific cycle of drought and deluge that we're seeing across the country, and having those conversations. And then moving further down the line of those conversations is, have you thought about what it looks like for succession planning? And would you consider a land back? Or, do you need to be meeting?
Define land back.
Land back is looking at who are the indigenous folks on the land, and what does it look like to work with them in concert to try and co-create different land systems and reciprocity, and working with them to just restore the land and be stewards of the land.
So in other words, get the land back into indigenous stewardship.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's one of the things that people are considering. Also, having conversations with Black and Latino farmers that often don't have access to land, even though, 30 years ago, I think there was close to 30% or 40% of farmers were Black, and now it's down to like 7%.
Oh my heavens.
Yeah, it's been just this horrific erosion of Black farmers. And so we're trying to have those conversations with predominantly, it is still white women landowners, and just having that, like, what does non-familial succession planning look like? What is looking like to put your farmland into trust, easements, all of those different sort of challenging conversations, connecting folks to other organizations that we work with in network, such as the Black Farmer Collaboratives, the Heal Food Alliance, different folks like that, and just saying, like, here's some conversations, here's some resources, so you can continue to explore what this might look like for you. So that's Women Caring for the Land.
And there's kind of like an art and storytelling component of that.
Yes. In Women Caring for the Land, again, when we talk in circle, we intentionally work to draw out those stories about how has your land been stewarded, how would you like to see it stewarded. Tell us a story about what it was like to try and move to organic on your land. Tell us a story about how your land flooded because the tenant didn't follow your beyond recommendation, your directives, right? Yeah. Which is very typical. And even in families, right? So let's say a family has 100 acres and then they subdivide it across their 3 children. And one of them is a woman landowner who now owns a third of that land. And she wants those 33 acres to be farmed organically. Well, her 2 brothers don't, right? And they're like, you're going to screw up our yields. You have to use this GMO seed. You have to use these pesticides. And they're like, no, I don't. And so that causes this strife within families. So they share those stories as well, right? Yeah. And how do you work through that? And part of that storytelling component is we have stewardship ambassadors, and these are women that have implemented ecological practices on their farmland, and then they go out to their communities and their friends and their family, and they say, this is what I'm doing, and this is why I'm doing it, and I hope you'll join me. And if you have any questions, let me connect you to resources so that we can further, bring other people along.
Yeah. Very interesting. How do you make those stories available, if you do, to people who might be listening to this show.
Yeah, no, they're all on our website, WFAN.org. And we're continuing to grow that cache of stories. Our communications manager, Piper Wood, she's amazing. And she's always looking for the next story. And then we're going to do some story mapping, which is going to be basically connecting. Like if you want to like go over New Mexico and say, where in New Mexico are there organic farmers that are part of Women, Food, and Agriculture Network that have a story, then you could click on their story. So those are the kind of things that we're moving into, and also increasing that with language access as well. We're committed to language access. So
Spanish primarily?
Starting with Spanish, yeah. But then there's Hmong has also been identified as a potential language to translate to.
Now, you are half Honduran. Did you grow up in a Latin American milieu?
No, actually, I was adopted at birth.
Okay.
So my half Honduran side is from my biological father's side, but I grew up outside of Chicago, and they're living now in Louisiana. But I grew up outside of Chicago with an amazing family, and shout out to my parents, all my parents.
Right.
I'm really lucky. All my parents are still alive, and I have great relationships with all of them.
And you know them all.
I know them all. But it's interesting, when I met my biological grandmother, I had already gotten married to my husband of 28 years, and he's from Chile, South America. And she's like, you married La Raza, and you didn't even know you were La Raza. It's kind of the joke.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
So another program that you have at WFAN, Women, Food, and Agriculture Network, is called Harvesting Our Potential. What's that all about?
So Harvesting Our Potential is our mentoring program. It's to really connect women and non-binary farmers to each other so that they can get a mentorship. And those go from 8 weeks to 6 months. We have them now in 6 or 8 states. In the last year, we expanded from the Midwest to the West through a Western SARE grant. And those mentorships are just really self-defined. There's 2 ways you can become a mentor or mentee. One is you can apply through our website to be a mentor or a mentee, and we will match you. The other is if you heard about the program and you already are a mentor, and you like, I have somebody that wants to be a mentee, and you come to us with a pair, we'll vet that pair and then let you define your goals. And so we have a midterm check-in and then an end of mentorship check-in. And both sides of the mentorship equation get $750 as a stipend to do the mentorship, which has been transformative for these women and non-binary farmers because, again, that lack of access to capital. And so we have, like, for example, a mentorship pair out of Colorado, and they really wanted to focus on water use because we're in the West. And as we talked about earlier, the cycle of drought and deluge, how to use water in the West is critical, in particular for, soil health. Soil health in the West looks very different than trying to build soil health in the Midwest. And so they explored all these different watering systems, irrigation systems, and were able to sort of identify, like, this is the one that would work for my relatively small farm. We're talking maybe 3 acres or so. And because of the $750, they were able to go out and get the implements that they needed to be able to put a really effective irrigation system.
It's almost like, you hear $750, you don't think capital, but it's like microloans.
Yes, exactly.
It's the difference between getting something done and not.
Yes, absolutely. And it's micro grant, right? And that's
Yeah.
even better because you don't have to worry about trying to build up. Farming is not for people who want to make millions, unless you're one of these foreign investors or even domestic investors that are buying farmland for capital rather than farmland for farmers.
Yeah.
But farming, particularly the kind of farming that most of our members do, which is not sort of the corn, wheat, soy farming. It's much more of the CSA farmers market, farming for their families, farming for their communities, farming.
Call it the stuff that's actually good for you.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah. Yeah, but it's interestingly treated because it's not commodity farming. Why am I spacing it out?
Specialty.
Right? Yes, specialty crops.
Yeah.
And I think I joked with you a couple of weeks ago that it's frustrating to me that the food boxes, we used to call them like, oh, you give government cheese, right? Because the government cheese was subsidized dairy that they would put into the food boxes that they would give out. And we saw that a lot during the pandemic lockdown, because obviously we're still dealing with COVID. But during the lockdown, the food boxes had government cheese again. And they would say government cheese. I'm like, why don't we have government zucchini?
Yeah.
Like, right? Like, why aren't those subsidies there for these specialty crop farmers that are actually growing food, have very little access to insurance? So if they have a crop failure, where the corn or the soybean grower has access to insurance to be able to like not have to risk so much, if a zucchini grower or specialty crop grower loses their entire crop, say in Rio, right, or any of these places that have seen, these fires, the floods, these cycles of drought and deluge, they don't have any recourse. They just lose everything.
Yeah.
And so you better have that second job, that off-farm job. Otherwise, you're going to be completely destitute.
And then that gets you into the cycle where people are called hobby farmers or gardeners, and that applies particularly to women a lot of the time.
Yeah. Because when you apply for loans or grants, if you have I want to say it's under 500 acres, you're considered a small farmer, which, 500 acres.
That's a lot of acres.
That's a lot of acres.
Especially depending what you're growing.
Right. And a lot of times these farmers that are selling at the farmers markets or even selling to restaurants or into these community food boxes, CSAs, they're growing on 5 acres or less. 10 acres or less. 5 acres is pretty big for a lot of these farmers. And that's not a hobby farm. And that certainly doesn't feel like a hobby farm when you're trying to go out and, you have to plant and you have to weed and you have to put the fish stuff on it, the fertilizer. I say that because I was out in Iowa with one of our farmers at Humble Hands Farm. And I think at Humble Hands, it's a cooperatively owned farm, predominantly by women, non-binary, and queer farmers. And they're amazing, and they do amazing work, and they have a CSA, almost a year-round CSA, but they're only on like 5 acres. But the day that I was out there, I was pulling weeds and then planting zucchini, just little zucchini starters, right? And I was dying by the end of the day, right? And so harvesting our potential, getting back to that mentoring program, because Hannah is one of the farmers that is our mentor and has had mentees on her farm at Humble Hands. And they're learning about like not just how to weed and use the backpack fertilizer, which is all organic, and put the starters in, and then how to do seed staving. That was one of their mentorships as well. But also how to get into CSAs, how to run a CSA, how to do your billings, how to manage the business side of farming, which, it's not like something that you can go to school for it, but it's few and far between.
Yeah. The business side and the marketing side.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Is there a political dimension to your work?
Yeah. So we have one of our programs is called Plate to Politics. And Plate to Politics started originally as a collaboration with an organization called Vote, Run, Lead, which was dedicated and is still dedicated to getting women into positions of political power, predominantly progressive women into positions of political power. And so we would have these oftentimes learning circles or certainly workshops about how to get into politics. What are the positions that are available for you to run for? What does that look like in terms of a timeline, in terms of budget? And then the pandemic came along and they reconfigured and we reconfigured. And so we're rebuilding that relationship with Vote, Run, Lead. But that also gave us an opportunity to really lean into our relationships with the National Family Farmers Coalition, or NFFC, as well as NSAC, which is National Sustainable Agricultural Coalition. And those two coalitions have been fundamental, particularly in the last couple of years, in terms of WFAN being able to be having a voice in politics. We've done fly-ins. We've brought farmers into fly-ins into D.C. and having conversations, frank conversations with our representatives, the representatives of our members throughout Congress, both the Senate and the House side, because right now we're supposed to be doing the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill was frankly supposed to be passed last year.
And it's not going to be passed this year.
It's not going to be passed this year. I mean, there's still a chance, right? They extended the deadline to the end of September. The House has put out a bill coming, at least a version, out of committee, and it's now theoretically able to be voted on. They have not called for a vote. I don't think that they will call for a vote. The markup, it's pretty rough. It's nothing that the majority of certainly the organizations that we work with want to see in it.
There's not incentives for regenerative farming?
Not at all.
Not at all.
Well, I shouldn't say not at all. Pretty much not at all, yeah. Right? And also, so the Senate side, which has been a version of it has been put forth by Debbie Stabenow, is a lot better. It's still not perfect because Debbie Stabenow recognizes like this has got to be a bipartisan bill or it's never going to get passed. And what the House version is definitely not bipartisan. Senator Stabenow's bill is a lot better in terms of what it does with using like the IRA, the money that was set aside during the COVID. The
Inflation Reduction Act.
Thank you. Yes, but the Inflation Reduction Act put aside a lot of money for conservation and doing that regenerative farming and putting into place those practices. And what we wanted to see was that those dollars would be put into the Farm Bill permanently. And there's been a lot of pushback from a certain side of the aisle.
I mean, I was reading an article the other day about people who are preppers, people who are preparing for the apocalypse. And one of the things that the article said is that the things you need to do to prepare for the apocalypse and the things that you need to do to avert the apocalypse are the same. And that is decentralized, sustainable, regenerative agriculture.
Yep. Yeah.
And it's like, the thing is, the whole problem, which I don't think of as a problem, but people in the mindset that we were talking about before do, is that when you have decentralized, sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture, everyone's going to make a living, but no one's going to make a lot of money.
Yes.
And investors aren't going to profit from it.
Correct.
And that is the way the food system should be, is that farmers are making a decent living and they're restoring the earth and restoring water cycles and restoring the climate and storing carbon and providing healthy food and thereby preventing all sorts of diseases that we have from an unhealthy diet. I mean, it's like a no-brainer.
Yep.
But it hasn't sunken into the collective, especially political and the people who are in power mindset, that is in fact the only path.
Yeah. I 100% agree with you. And I've seen it in my personal life as well at the political, at the sort of higher levels. So at the higher level, for example, one of the marker bills or one of the bills that we wanted to hopefully get into the Farm Bill, the final thing is the Farm Bill, is the Farmland for Farmers Act. And the Farmland for Farmers Act it disallows investments into farmland. So farmland goes up for sale. Instead of being able to swoop in and get all the farmland as just an investment property or to put it into commodity farming, it has to instead go first to small farmers.
That sounds like a very good idea.
Yeah, it's a very good idea. And there had to be some tweaks because originally the way it was written was going to disallow farmer cooperatives from purchasing land, such as Humble Hands Farm in Iowa. And so we had some input on that to try and say, no, we have to make sure that this language is written in a way that doesn't have farmer cooperatives excluded. And so they changed it up a little bit, but it's still languishing, right? And so
it's so important.
It's so important. And being able to have parity pricing for the farmers that are not commodity farming, that are doing specialty farming. So that, I think, is some of those acts and movements on the bigger political level, but on the personal level, on the community level, on the block level, right? I have a neighbor who lives across the street from me down in Albuquerque, and he keeps chickens. We're in downtown Albuquerque, like we're in Wells Park. He keeps chickens. He and I don't see eye to eye politically, but we get along personally because he's a prepper. He's definitely, he knows how to hunt. He knows how to garden. He's got a beautiful garden. He's helping our other neighbors to garden, and even though they don't necessarily see eye to eye with him politically, right? And we're having those conversations because, like, we all recognize, like, if we don't start building community and understanding, like, whose resources are, where the resources are and where that knowledge is, that we're going to be in trouble deep when things start to collapse. And I do think that things are going to collapse at some levels.
And the food system in particular, I mean, what we're doing to the soil and to water and air and communities is unsustainable. So when something's unsustainable, eventually it collapses. That's the definition of unsustainable.
Right.
So, yeah.
So he knows that we have honey and we keep bees. And so we're sharing the knowledge with him on how to keep bees and in the meantime, sharing our honey with him. And then he shares his eggs with us. And, I save egg cartons for him and he saves jars for me. And then we have these little, conversations. We definitively don't talk about things like, oh, what happened in the last debate? And, what happened? It's like, no, we're not going to go there because it's not going to solve anything. But what we can talk about is, hey, can you help me build this box? Or can you help me save the cartons for chickens, for eggs? And then when I had a yard sale, oh, can you put this in the yard sale for me? Or vice versa, right? Just really building community and getting to know each other as people and understanding that.
Which is the basis of rural communities.
Right.
Ongoing. I mean, it's not something that urban people have to learn.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I think we see that. But even rural communities, because our country's so divided right now, like this is real life, and this is going to have real world implications for what happens, meaning like red or blue. Are you red or blue? It's not that simple, right? And I think a lot of people's reality is that it's not that stark, red or blue.
Well, I think there's also, we're talking about women in food and agriculture. There is a bit of gender tied up with this too, because a lot of times women want to talk about policy and men want to talk about the race.
Yes.
Yeah. Who's ahead?
Yes, exactly. Which, again, sports teams.
Yeah.
But when you talk about policy, I think also, so this is one of the things when we're looking at Plate to Politics this year, as we shift out of farm bill mode and more into get out the vote mode, we're really focusing on vote your values. What are your values? What are the things that are important to you? Is it maintaining the viability of a small family farm or small farm in general? Is it getting the land back to Indigenous stewardship? Is it having the opportunity for BIPOC farmers to get access to land? Is it being able to build soil health, getting away from toxic pesticides? Is, farm worker rights? Do you want to see farm worker rights? There's an amazing organization called Not My Farm that is doing amazing work. They're a nationwide organization, but one of the founders is here in New Mexico. And they really look at what do farm worker abuses look like, especially as we're living on a warming planet. What are the things that are being put into place to allow farm workers to not die as they're trying to, get our food into the system? So
and death is a pretty high bar. Suffer.
Yeah, suffer. Suffer. It's suffer and no access to health care. Right. Let's talk about access to health care. Let's talk about access to housing. We've heard in the last, I think, month and a half of at least 3 accidents where multiple farm workers died. And the number one way that farm workers die oftentimes is going from their homes or their communities out to the fields and back because they're driving horrible vans that are carrying 20-some people. They're exhausted by the end of the day because the same person that's driving them from the community to the farm and back, because there's no housing. There's very little housing, certainly housing that is anything that anybody could live in, particularly with their families. There's so many issues, but policy gets to all of that, right? And basic human rights. What are we considering basic human rights? And so when you're talking about that as a value and you're looking at who am I going to vote for or how am I going to vote, what are the 2 candidates or 3 candidates or however many candidates, for that position are running, what have they said about the things that you care about?
Yeah.
And if they haven't said anything, push them. Here's where you go. Here's how you go to a community town hall. Here's how you can go online and ask them questions. Here's how you can write to your representatives and tell them what's important to you. And you may get a generic letter back. I get generic letter backs all the time. But
they do read them.
They do. They do.
Now, one of the things that's happened is just recently there have been some policy changes, including on the level of the Supreme Court. Yeah. What's going on there and how does it affect farmers, women farmers?
So I haven't dug all the way in yet because it's been overwhelming. It's been an overwhelming week and a half since some of these decisions have come down. But one that is particularly concerning with regards to an ecological food and farming system and a just food and farming system are the ones that look at the chevron, which then takes away from expertise such as the EPA, to be able to look and regulate and say, like, these are the experts. Like, just watched Dark Waters, which is a biopic movie. It looks at the case against DuPont, who is also really big in food and farming systems, right? And how self-regulation really failed some communities out in West Virginia because they were not self-regulating. They were not looking at what the effects of their basically externalization of their waste was doing to the food and the water systems. And so the original person that brought the lawsuit against DuPont was a farmer, was a dairy farmer who saw his cows dying by the hundreds and had never had an issue. And DuPont started to say, oh, well, we found that through our vets that looked at the cows, that it was mismanagement by this dairy farmer who'd been doing it for decades and not recognizing
And what was it, a toxic chemical?
It was toxic chemical. It was the basis of Teflon that they were, putting in the water system. Because I have my MBA in environmental management, and one of the few things that I learned when I got my MBA was that the attitude of business, particularly of large corporations, is if it's not explicitly illegal, then it's legal, and if it's legal, it's ethical, right? Like, that's the mentality. That's
crazy.
That brain thought, and that's exactly what came to light here, right?
And it's also so hypocritical because it's like they'll do their best to influence any laws that go against their ability to dump toxic chemicals.
Correct. And now you have this case, the Chevron case, that instead of going to, say, the experts, the subject matter experts at the EPA or other agencies and saying, like, what are your findings here? What do we know about these toxic chemicals? They go, oh, the courts will tell you if it's okay. Like, the courts have an idea of whether, it's just absurd, but I don't think people understand, like, how this is going to affect them.
How is it going to affect them?
Well, I think, I look at that case that was brought up in that movie, and they wouldn't have been able to go to subject matter experts that were outside of DuPont to be able to say, like, this is what happened. And instead, DuPont chemists and DuPont folks could just go to their lawyers, and the lawyers would present and say, oh, no, our client says it's fine.
And, of course, the other side gets to present its case, but they don't always have as many resources.
Right. What
happened in the DuPont Teflon case? Did the farmer win?
So it took over 20 years to wind through the courts, which, again, by the time that it was fully resolved, the farmer that brought the original lawsuit died of cancer himself. His wife also had cancer. Interestingly, close to 40,000 community members gave blood samples to be able to determine whether or not it was in their blood. These are forever chemicals. These were not PFASs, but PFOAs, I think they were called. After 7 years, they did find that everybody had it in their blood and that they were the leading cause of 6 major illnesses, including 2 forms of cancer. And then they had them at a mediated agreement to say, all right, if we find that there is a link between these chemicals, A, that they're in people's bloods, and B, that there is a link to illness, that you, DuPont, will pay for medical monitoring and damages based on if they get cancer. And, they had to monitor for their lifetimes. Well, then once they did make that link, they said, no, we're going to renege on that. And they backed out of it. And they said, fine. There were close to 3,500 cases then that were brought against DuPont. And they said, you're going to have to do each one of those cases in an individual case. And this attorney said, fine. And in the first case, he won. He got like $1.7 million. And the second case he won, he got like $5.6 million. The third case he won, he got like $7.8 million. And so each consecutive case, he kept winning case after case after case. And they finally said, okay, fine. And they settled for, I think it was $671 million with all the plaintiffs, which sounds like a lot, but in reality is not.
Spread over that many thousand people.
Exactly.
And also, you can't buy back somebody's life or health.
No. You can't buy back somebody's life or health. And look at the cost ratio to profit ratio, right? So yeah, they are including now in their, not just DuPont, but most of these big agri-corporations and corporations in general, the cost of litigation and payouts in the cost of doing business. So it's not wholly externalized, but it's pretty externalized, right? So yes, they had
externalized, meaning you pass the cost of the damage onto society instead
Correct.
of being responsible for it yourself.
Correct. And so you talk about 671 million. Poor DuPont. They had to pay all this money. How many billions with a B?
Yeah.
And people don't recognize the magnitude of billions with a B over millions with an M.
You were talking about the Women in Agriculture Act, which is something that has been proposed. A proponent is Teresa Leger Fernandez, who is one of the representatives to U.S. Congress from New Mexico. What is that all about?
So C and Shelley Pingree are two representatives that have put forward it. And now we have another representative who just made a addendum to that out of Florida. Basically, it came out of these listening sessions with women farmers and ranchers and looking at what are the needs and what are the challenges that are facing women ranchers and farmers. And in addition to the research to go into ergonomically correct or ergonomically accommodating farming and ranching equipment, there's also a component about providing subsidies and expanding childcare access, which is so important in particularly rural communities where a lot of the farming and ranching takes place. And it acknowledges that even though it's 2024, the expectation that women farmers and ranchers are going to also expect to still take care of those kids, still put them on your back or put them to work in the fields, instead of recognizing that we need early childhood education and we need access to childcare and healthy childcare. And
put your infant to work.
Yeah.
Put your toddler to
work. Put your toddler. You got those baby Bjorns, right? Just go ahead, stick them on the front of you, and you can make this work. Put a nice hat on them. And it's like, how are we still doing this in 2024? Yeah, so I think it's critical that the Women in Agriculture Act pass, but also that we have a bigger, broader conversation about childcare and women's labor.
Right. Not just in agriculture,
right.
in all parts of life. There's also a piece of it which would provide a liaison to the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Yes. And that is also a huge thing. And it's interesting. I talked about Denise O'Brien, who was one of the founding mothers of WFAN. And I was very excitedly came to her last summer. And I said, "Oh, did you hear about the Women in Agriculture Act?" And she said, "I really hope that it goes somewhere." She said, "But we've been fighting the same fight for over 25 years and trying to get a liaison in the USDA for women in agriculture, and they keep pushing back and keep pushing back." So this representative out of Florida actually is also putting an addendum to the Women in Agriculture Act that really helps support women agriculture groups such as WFAN and other women in agriculture groups to be able to have a bigger voice and a stronger voice in terms of allocating finances or allocating grant monies to organizations that support women in agriculture. So those are huge.
You are going to be speaking at the Regenerate Conference in November, the first weekend of November in Denver, Colorado. What will you be doing?
So we're actually going to be co-presenting with American Farmland Trust. They have a Women Caring for the Land. When we started Women Caring for the Land, they co-started it with us. And then they kind of have their own program now, and we have our own programs, but we're still very close. And we're really excited to present together this enhanced learning circle that is based off of the Stories of the Season, which is a project that we've been doing together with them in Iowa. And the Stories of the Season is really gathering stories about women farmers and ranchers and their reactions or their observations about climate change and how it's affecting their world, their lives, and creating space within the conference to have those conversations. It's interesting to me that this conference is actually starting the day after the election. So it'll be on November 6th. So we'll see how this goes, because I think that holding any kind of space on that day in particular is going to be challenging, but so necessary, because we are very cognizant, particularly the folks that go to the Regenerate Conference, are very cognizant of the effects of climate change, the effects on our food and farming systems, but also the effects on our just day-to-day lives.
Yeah.
And it's not often encouraged or the space created to have those really frank conversations about what is happening in our day-to-day lives and what we're looking at for our children and our children's lives based on these elections, based on these current challenges.
Yeah.
We just had our first earliest Category 5 hurricane in recorded history. We've had the fires in Ruidoso. We have fires in California right now. There's fires in Alaska. We've had extended drought. I mean, this year's been incredible in terms of deluge here in New Mexico.
Yeah, drought and flood, and the way those things go together, and the way that regenerated land can really soften both of those.
Right. But it's also when our systems are built on a certain understanding of how the climate works, and now climate is shifting and weather patterns are shifting so dramatically, we haven't been able to build the resilience, I don't think yet, to be able to react in a way that does it. I mean, I was watching video from Ruidoso just this morning. You know, you had the fires and then you had the burn scars and then they've just gotten incredible flooding. I mean, the flooding is just mind-boggling, and that keeps happening, right? And so even if you're talking about things like, you know, growing agroforestry, if you're growing agroforestry, but we're not taking into account these wildfires and how that is like decimating half of eastern New Mexico, you know, so.
Well, on a happy note, we will end. Jules Salinas is Executive Director of Women, Food, and Agriculture Network, which is at WFAN.org. And she will be at the Regenerate Conference, which is November 6th through 8th in Denver, Colorado. You can find out more about that at regenerateconference.com. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. So appreciate you.
You've been listening to Down to Earth. We would love it if you would support this program, which you can do by going to patreon.com/down-to-earth planet to plate, where you can sign up for as little as $3. Patreon is Patreon. And also please rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. The Quivira Coalition is a not-for-profit and a community network of ranchers, farmers, conservationists, scientists, educators, and many others dedicated to regenerative practices that produce healthy food, support meaningful livelihoods, sustain biodiversity, and remedy the impacts of climate change. To learn more about Quivira and how you can support their work, visit quiviracoalition.org, Quivira. And finally, this show is a production with the Radio Cafe. You can check out radiocafe.org to hear back episodes of this show and also find all kinds of other shows on a wide variety of topics as well. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.